A view of the Hales Place area as it looks today from the top of St Stephen's Hill with Downs Road in the foreground. The map shows the primary roads making up the estate and the position of the chapel in Tenterden Drive. The real story, however, begins in the year 1227 when Archbishop Stephen Langton built a mansion in the early English style for his brother Simon Langton, the Archdeacon of Canterbury. Around this time, St Stephen's Church was enlarged, probably by Simon Langton. The sketch of the church dates from 1829. This mansion, which stood to the west of the churchyard and included the area where the shops now stand, was subsequently given by Queen Elizabeth I to Sir Roger Manwood about 1562. Sir Roger, who lived from 1525 to 1592, was Lord Chief Baron of the Exchequer and a native of Sandwich. When Sir Roger took over the house, he found it in a ruinous state and decided to build it up again in a manner suitable to his condition. He famously founded the almshouses at St Stephen's in 1570, and also the grammar school at Sandwich that bears his name. The memorial to Sir Roger Manwood in St Stephen's Church was erected in the latter part of the 16th century. Constructed of Betherston marble, it was designed by Maximilian Coult, a Huguenot, who also carved a memorial to Queen Elizabeth I in Westminster Abbey. Below the bust of Sir Roger are figures of his first wife, Dorothy, their 5 children, and his second wife, Elizabeth. The sword, helmet and gauntlet suspended above the monument are now in display at the Museum of Canterbury in Stour Street. Sir Roger gave the church font in 1591 and was probably responsible for rebuilding the south transept, which includes the large window showing the arms of the family. Following the death of Sir Roger in 1592, his career having been somewhat tarnished towards the end of his life, he was succeeded by his son Peter. He was a scholar, and Marcus Crouch, in his book Canterbury, wrote that he made his house at Hackington a place where wit and wisdom would always find a welcome. Peter had to move abroad after getting into financial difficulties, but returned to die in his own house in 1625, his son John, Lieutenant Governor of Dover Castle, taking over the title. Before Sir John's death in 1642, the property was sold to Sir Thomas Culpeper, who had also been a governor of Dover Castle. When Sir Thomas died in 1643, he was followed by his son, Colonel Thomas Culpeper. At this time, the house was both known as Place House and St Stephen's House. In 1675, the estate was sold to the Hales family of Tunstall, and Edward, 3rd Baronet Hales of Woodchurch, took over the mansion, commonly called Place House. Sir Edward was of the Catholic faith and a friend of King James II, the baronetcy having been created in the year 1611 for the first Sir Edward Hales. Sir Edward died in 1695 and was succeeded by his second son, Sir John, who kindly donated the single-hand clock on St Stephen's Church in 1730. He it was who provided a water supply to the city, and a plaque in Longport commemorates this. The plaque reads, "Sir John Hales, Baronet, gave this water, and at his own charge had it brought hither 1733. A rather strange man, Sir John allowed a son to die in the debtors' prison at the Westgate, and died as a recluse himself. In his will, he left money for the maintenance of the sick and most necessitous of the parish. Sir John died in 1744, and his grandson Edward became the 5th Baronet. During the years 1766 to 1768, a new sumptuous edifice was built on a more eligible site, on rising ground, overlooking the city and the cathedral, fronted by a terrace, what we now call the Terrace. The old mansion was now superseded by a grand new house named New Place, and a map of 1769 shows both houses. The original Manwood mansion was then demolished, and Surgeon Captain Kenneth Jones, who lived at the manor house in St Stephen's Road, recalled that when the foundations of the shops in Hales Drive were dug out in the early 1930s, he saw what he believed to be bricks from the old Tudor mansion. When the St Stephen's Church Hall was extended in 1993, the Canterbury Archaeological Trust found evidence of a number of brick walls, probably associated with the mansion, as well as demolition debris. A large chapel was built on the southern side of the new mansion in the late 18th century, and Roman Catholics from the city and local area used this as their church. Sir Edward gave the avenue of trees in the drive, now Hales Drive, in around 1770, and in 1793 the estate sold off land in Longport for the proposed Kent and Canterbury Hospital. A year later, 16 acres were sold in Military Road for the erection of a new barracks. The sketch of the mansion, with the chapel, was published in 1794. Sir Edward passed away in 1802 and was followed by his son, another Edward, as the 6th Baronet. When he died in 1829 without issue, the baronetcy became extinct. The estate, comprising 4,000 acres of arable and pasture land, hop gardens, assorted buildings, and the great house, some 540 feet in length, passed eventually to Mary Barbara Felicity Hales in 1837, when she was just over 1 year old. She had been born in Boulogne in December 1835 and was rushed to Canterbury to be baptised by Father James Quinn in St George's Parish. The engraving shown, featuring the so-called canal, dates from 1830. In December 1856, Miss Hales attained her majority, and to celebrate this occasion, all the tenants of the estate were invited to meet her around the festive board and to wish her Godspeed in good old English fashion. Miss Hales was described as knowing the duties as well as the advantages of her position and desired to be the head of a contented and thriving tenantry. The bells of St Stephen's Church rang out on what was described as a day of joy and rejoicing. Miss Hales, educated in a French convent, became a novice in the Carmelite convent of Paris in 1858. A year later, she became Sister Mary Clare, having taken the solemn vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. In 1863, she transferred to the English Carmelites and then returned to Hales Place to undertake the building of a convent in the grounds. In the words of Christopher Buckingham, she attempted, until her self-willed and uncompromising temperament ruined the plan, to bring the Carmelite nuns to Canterbury. Having failed in her first scheme, she succeeded in getting a dispensation in Rome for her vows of obedience and poverty. She had never been obedient and could hardly been called poor, wrote Christopher Buckingham. And she started a Benedictine priory on the partially built Carmelite structure, originally designed by Edward Welby Pugin. The 1871 census stated that the estate comprised 4,434 acres, of which 900 were farmed, and which employed 14 men and 1 boy. Miss Hales lived in the main part of the mansion with 3 servants and a gardener, and at that time owned a champion mastiff called Lion, which won 35 prizes, including an award for the best mastiff at the Crystal Palace in 1871. Great Danes were another favourite of hers, and in an advert placed in the Kentish Gazette of the 17th of March 1868, she was disposing of a splendid Newfoundland dog for £15. In the same advert, she offered eggs from her prize Spanish fowls at 1 guinea per dozen, as well as black Spanish cockerels and silver-grey Dorking pullets. The sketch of the mansion was drawn by Miss Hales. Having given away or spent most of her wealth, Miss Hales declared herself bankrupt in 1879, and the following year sold the Hales Place Mansion and adjoining land to French Jesuits from Lyon for the sum of £24,000. The contents of the house were sold off by Phillips of New Bond Street, London, over a period of some days, and the 100-page catalogue of nearly 2,000 items realised £10,700. At that time her debts were in excess of £25,000, and among the local creditors were Messrs. Drury and Biggleston, who eventually purchased a fair amount of the estate's lands. Folly Farm, which now stands just off Headcorn Drive, of some 171 acres, had been part of the estate, but was sold on to the Lawrence family in 1904. The fields at that time included Lilly's Field, Gates Marsh, Cooper's Marsh, Park Meadow, Long Meadow, and Barton Down, as well as Brickhouse Wood. Miss Hales died in poverty at Sarr Court, Thanet, in April 1885 in her 50th year, and was buried in the Hales Place Chapel on the 26th of April. The bells of the cathedral and St Stephen's Church tolled. The Roman Catholic Hales family and the members of St Stephen's Church had coexisted well over many years. And at the gates of Hales Place, a long procession of boys, priests and Benedictines from Ramsgate met the hearse for the journey up the drive. When the mansion was demolished in 1928, the remains of Miss Hales and others were reinterred in the small cemetery chapel which now stands in Tenterden Drive. With the death of Miss Hales, a new chapter was beginning to unfold. The old mansion, now called St Mary's College, opened as a school for French and other nationals, but excluding English, in November 1880, but closed 10 years later. In the early 1880s, 2 new wings were added to the mansion, which contained various sitting and study rooms, a chemical laboratory, 12 classrooms, a dining hall, and 2 refectories. The dormitories were situated on the 2nd floor of the 3-storey wings, which were of a similar design to that of the mansion. On completion of the first new wing in 1882, the Jesuit fathers gave a dinner for 200 of the contractor's workforce. As a result of the Jesuits coming to Hales Place, the Sisters of Our Lady of the Missions arrived at Westbere in 1881. They established a chapel and were soon involved in setting up a laundry to service the college. They started a small school in 1918, which grew into St. Anne's Convent. Ginder's Handbook of Canterbury for 1886 recorded that 260 youths were being educated at the college, but they were not welcomed by everyone. The Kentish Gazette reported in 1881 that the council had received complaints that students, walking arm in arm, had forced people off the pavement and into the road. Apparently, the rules of the Jesuit order said that students should walk 3 by 3. The town clerk was instructed to write to the Jesuits, asking that steps be taken to remedy the annoyance. The handbook also stated that within the estate's 200 acres were 7 cedar trees, the biggest ever known in England. The fact that the River Stour was not far away was mentioned with the additional information that 2 large boats, the Victoria and the France, built in the boatyards of Tamise, occasionally took 25 students as far as Sandwich. In 1888, the monument to the Sacred Heart was erected on the terrace, in front of the mansion, with Latin inscriptions marking the foundation of the college, and its dedication by the Bishop of Southwark. Another statue of the Virgin Mary was positioned to the west of the chapel and close to one of the playgrounds. After the school closed, the building was used by the Jesuits as juvenate and novitiate until 1899, when they departed. For 2 years, French sisters of the Notre Dame from London were in residence, but in 1901, more Jesuits from the province of Lyon arrived to open a theological seminary. In 1914, one of its scholars was Teilhard de Chardin, who became a famous theologian. In the meantime, the little dovecote had been converted into a mortuary chapel, and the first student was buried in its cemetery in 1884. In 1916, the rector of St Mary's College and a student were prosecuted for not complying with the regulations which required departing and returning aliens to report to the police. The rector, in his defence, said that the Jesuits had done all they could during the war in helping the police by giving information, and had thrown open their doors of the college to nurse the wounded and giving hospitality to injured French soldiers. However, they were still fined 15 shillings each. When local boys were found scrumping in the grounds, many of them told how they were made to clean the students' shoes as recompense. Although Hales Place was partly occupied by the military in the First World War, its demise became fairly certain when, in 1923, the Jesuits were welcomed back to France to take up residence in their former premises. In 1925, Hales Place, an important and extensive collegiate property, with its other buildings, was put up for sale. The auction catalogue described it thus: Hales Place enjoys perfect seclusion in a well-chosen position, well protected from the north and east on a southern slope, providing charming, uninterrupted views over the typical intervening lands to the city of Canterbury beyond. The historical cathedral in the distance forming a prominent and pleasing feature of the prospect. Also listed were substantially constructed detached premises, walled-in fruit and vegetable gardens, pleasure grounds comprising 45 acres of undulating woodlands, intersected by 3 avenues with winding paths, which afford delightful and shady walks, 55 acres of park-like pasture, 7 acres of orchards, and 30 acres of arable land. On the ground floor of the centre block of Hales Place, there was a glazed entrance portico leading into a spacious hall and to the main staircase. The auction also included the home farm and 6 cottages. The farm, pictured in the 1880s, lay to the north of the main premises and survived until the late 1940s. The cottages included the entrance lodge at the bottom of the drive, a bungalow cottage on the edge of the estate to the north of the college, another dwelling close to the ruins of the nunnery, and premises which housed the boiler room with its extremely large engines. Other premises were a pair of brick and slate-built cottages with a walled garden, now 8 St Stephen's Hill, and a brick and tiled detached cottage, now Hackington Haven, 56 St Stephen's Hill, which was occupied by Mr W. Hames, the bailiff. The auction failed to find a suitable purchaser for the buildings, and in 1927 the mansion and estate, now derelict, were purchased by Mr Radford Arthur Dagnall of the London Mortar Mills R.A. Dagnall Limited haulage contractors. Early in 1928, the fixtures and fittings were auctioned off prior to the demolition of the main buildings, including the chapel. The high altar from the chapel, of finely carved stone, inlaid with coloured marble, was sold for £200 and went to a church at Dulwich. The carved stone pulpit sold for £25, and a 2-manual organ by Gray and Davison realised £170. Part of the estate had already been sold, including land purchased by the King's School, now the Burley's Sports Field, for use as playing fields. Mr Dagnall's son, Harry, was a pupil at the school and recalls his class picking up stones from the field on one afternoon a week. At the conclusion of the sale, lots comprising the fabric of the buildings were offered, and these resulted in £1,050 being realised for bricks and £3,250 for the shell of the mansion, comprising 3.5 million bricks. In the Kentish Express report of the time, it was stated that the site would be developed on Garden City lines, for which purpose it is most admirably situated and adapted. During the Easter weekend in April 1928, The grounds were open to the public, admission sixpence, in aid of the new hospital fund. The Kentish Gazette of the 7th of April 1928 described the demolition of Hales Place, the policy of which was to bring down the walls comparatively gently in order to preserve intact as many bricks as possible, since, being of excellent quality, they were much in demand for building operations. The operators expressed themselves well satisfied with the number of bricks that remained whole, and motor lorries and steam wagons in a continuous stream were busy removing the bricks and rubble to various parts of East Kent. The Kent Herald of the 24th of May 1928 carried a photograph of the demolition in progress. As local residents know, many houses in the vicinity were built with the reclaimed bricks, and many garden walls have a mixture of brick and stone from the site, one or two having items of particular interest. Harry Dagnall wrote to Christopher Buckingham in 1996 with his recollection of the demolition, and recalled that a wall collapsed on a workman who he thinks was killed. His father built a house for the family at the eastern end of the terrace, which had a lich gate, double garage and tennis court. As the property was in a rather isolated position, the nearest electricity supply was at St Stephen's. Mr Dagnall overcame this problem by installing a bank of accumulators in the garage with a small petrol generator. Not an ideal solution, as 110-volt lamps were not easy to obtain. The younger son, Brian, also mentioned that their phone number was rather unique: Canterbury 1. George Reeves, who developed the Chestfield estate in the 1920s, and William G. Thomas of Kingston upon Thames, acquired most of the saleable building materials. George Reeves purchased much of the chapel and used the materials to embellish several of the large houses he built, including a barn-type house in the drive at Chestfield, which contains the reconstructed rose window. In the spring of 1930, houses of distinction on the Hales Place estate were being advertised in the local press. By 1932, Mr Dagnall was bankrupt, and much of the estate was now being developed by William Thomas, the new owner. In the Kentish Gazette of the 7th of May 1932, a full-page advertisement read, "The best houses in Kent are being built at Hales Place." These houses were priced at £775. A deposit of £25 was required, with a number on the St Stephen's Hill estate at £595. The more upmarket properties, probably in Manwood Avenue, were priced at £1,650. An accompanying article had a headline of "Sunshine Suburb for Canterbury, Hales Place Estate as a Garden City, Healthy and Picturesque Homes." The 138 acres of good Kentish loam could accommodate 600 houses, and the writer made much of the fact that each house had its own architectural individuality. The advert also mentioned the all-weather tennis courts that had been constructed, near to which a grand pavilion was being built with an oak floor, eminently calculated to meet the needs of dancers. In 1934, a plan of the proposed scheme of development for Mr Thomas was published, and featured an arterial road running north of St Stephen's Church through the estate, part of the proposed northern bypass of the city. Apart from the terrace, other road names included the Crescent, Manwood Avenue, Downs Road, Hillcrest Road, Copse Hill, Hermitage Way, the Spinney, the Avenue, the Cloisters, and King's Close. In fact, the present-day layout is somewhat removed from what was proposed. In 1934, the opening of the summer tennis season at the Hales Place Club was celebrated with a personal demonstration of ballroom dancing by Mr. and Mrs. Victor Sylvester, world champion dancers, with Guy Snowdon and his band. Evening dress was required, with tickets priced at 3 shillings and sixpence single and 6 shillings and sixpence double. Eddie Newport and his band, a local favourite, performed regularly at the pavilion. By the mid to late 1930s, nearly a dozen properties had been built on St Stephen's Hill, below the turning into Manwood Avenue, as well as the 12 dwellings in Tyler Close. Apart from the old gatehouse in Hales Drive, the Lodge, just a handful of properties had been erected at the bottom and opposite the recently erected shops, the general stores run by Charles Piddock, and the post office and stores by Frank Flavin. Downs Road boasted about 16 dwellings and remained a cul-de-sac until the prefabs were built at the end of the Second World War, just after a victory party was held. Manwood Avenue had some 10 properties. Orchard Close had its full complement of 20 dwellings. The Crescent just had the one, Hales Wood, and a mere 3 houses had been built on the terrace to accompany Mr. Dagnall's Lichgate. A few more properties were built before the commencement of the war, but major development had to wait until the war was over. By the late 1940s, hardly any new properties had been built, apart from the 100 or so prefabs, or portal dwellings, in the continuation of Downs Road. Pam Smith recalls that German prisoners of war were used for this purpose. This site was chosen after a fierce battle had prevented them being built on Beverley Meadow. The rector of St Stephen's, the Reverend Arthur Barnes, made his feelings plain in a strong letter to the Kentish Gazette on the 14th of October 1944. Present residents can be grateful for the opposition to the proposed site. Another sign of the times was that the old pavilion was now being used as a depository by Messrs Pickford. By 1955, some of the houses on Hales Drive had been completed, and the new St Stephen's County Primary School had been erected on land below the terrace in 1952. The terrace and the Crescent were awaiting further development, and this took place, along with Moorfield, by the end of the decade. With the council planning more housing, an article appeared in the Kentish Express in December 1952 under a headline, "Will Houses Bring Peace to Haunted Woods?" It went on, "Civilization in the form of a new housing estate is soon to come to the Jesuits, and the monks who have been keeping a silent vigil over their home of bygone centuries will, according to local legend, never be seen again." Houses were not popular at the Jesuits, and only a few were built. Then came the war. Now, Canterbury Council, searching for sites, has decided that next year a housing estate will be built there. The last person to see the monks was silver-haired Mr. Horace Kent, a Canterbury dentist, who told the paper, "I was peacefully asleep in the front bedroom of my house at number 4 The Terrace, next to where the mansion stood, when some unknown force compelled me to wake up and go to the window. I drew back the curtains and looked out in bright moonlight to see a column of robed monks walking 2 by 2, quite noiselessly, along the terrace towards their chapel. It was in the early hours of the morning and was almost weird." The canny villagers of St. Stephen's say this means that the monks, happy that the future of their former home has been decided, will leave the scene for good. The 2-celled construction, which Pam Smith referred to as the Monk's House, was located on a raised bank, and children would enjoy climbing on it to survey the view. Pam has vivid memories of this from her childhood, the cell supposedly having a secret underground link to the cathedral. This photograph shows Sue and Geoffrey Daniel, who lived in Manwood Avenue, standing on what they described as the Hermit Caves, where Coppinger Close now stands, in 1959. By the mid-1960s, Tenterden Drive, with its offshoots, leading from the terrace to Downs Road, was fully developed. Construction of the council properties began in 1956, and Godden Road, Tunstall Road and Montfort Close, all names associated with the Hales family, were fully established. Just off Tenterden Drive was the mortuary chapel and cemetery, which had fallen into disrepair. An article under the heading "Cluttered Canterbury" in the Kentish Gazette of the 12th of January 1968 featured the chapel thus: "In the middle of Canterbury's fastest growing estate at Hales Place, a solitary copse surrounds what appears to be an abandoned dovecote. But only the small circular area around the chapel is actually consecrated ground. The rest of the patch, about 1.5 acres, is zoned for development as shops and a community centre. Nothing final has yet been decided about the form this is to take." In the late 1960s, the council developed Longmeadow Way, following the line of the old estate boundary to the rear of Downs Road, and the various cul-de-sacs leading from it, for example, Jesuit Close and Culpeper Close. In the 1970s, the Headcorn Drive area was developed, and the temporary prefabs of Downs Road were replaced by permanent homes. In 1974, John Boyle, the former town clerk and resident of St. Stephen's, published his book Portrait of Canterbury, and wrote about the neglected chapel with its smashed down headstones and a ring fence of broken wire, thorn and brambles, and concluded, "Its unseemly state was a reproach to the city." The chapel had actually become the legal responsibility of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Southwark, and had apparently been restored in 1950. In 1976, David Cousins and Christopher Buckingham launched an appeal to refurbish the chapel and cemetery, the latter containing the mortal remains of Sir Edward Hales, the 5th Baronet, the Dowager Lady Frances Hales, Mary Barbara Felicity Hales, as well as the bodies of 19 French Jesuits and students connected with St. Mary's College. The appeal was launched under the auspices of the Hales Place Chapel Committee of St Thomas Church and the Kent Recusant History Society. In due course, the chapel was recognised as a building of historic and architectural interest and became a Grade II listed building. Initially, it was thought that the restoration work would cost in the region of £2,000, but by 1980 the estimate was around £5,000. Thankfully, Canterbury architect Anthony Swain became involved in the late 1970s, and under his guidance the restoration took place, assisted by a grant from the City Council. The work was carried out by Messrs E. Fuller and Sons Limited of Faversham in 1981, and in 1984 the City Council took over the ownership. Christopher Buckingham and Anthony Swain are shown together in this 1987 photograph in front of the chapel. The chapel contains a statue of the Madonna and Child, dated 7th of September 1875, and a funeral brass to Sir Edward Hales, the 5th Baronet, who died in 1802, in medieval costume, and which was formerly in the main chapel. In 1994, the Friends of Hales Place Chapel was re-established, and a year later members of the public were able to visit the building when it was opened under the Heritage Open Days scheme. Unfortunately, Christopher Buckingham died in 1996 following an accident, and the sudden death of David Cousins a few years later brought to an end 20 years of involvement in the saving of the chapel, a tangible link to the old Hales Place Mansion and the family who gave it its name. There are, however, a few visible links with the Hales Place of the past. The boundary wall of the estate at the rear of Downs Road and Longmeadow Way still survives in part, and other old walls off Longmeadow Way and behind Hoare Close and the adjoining pond can still be seen. Part of a pillar can be seen at the entrance to Manwood Avenue at the top of Hales Drive, and traces of the wall close to the church hall are also visible. Much of what has been recorded here is based on the research undertaken by Christopher Buckingham and David Cousins. The help received from the following is gratefully acknowledged: Faye Noakes, Kin McIntosh, Pam Smith, Liz Valentine, Pauline Walters, Violet Wright, John Batchelor, Tony Blake, Paul Crampton, Gilbert Lawrence, and Martin Rogers. The musical excerpts are taken from a CD by the St Stephen's Church Choir entitled Choral Music for the Church Year, by kind permission of Stephen Barker, organist and choirmaster.